In the summer of 1341, a Norwegian priest named Ivar Bardason climbed into a small open boat and rowed north along the fjords of Greenland, looking for people who were no longer there. He had been sent by the bishop to check on the western settlement, a cluster of Norse farms clinging to the green edge of a frozen world. He expected smoke rising from turf roofs, the smell of boiling milk, children shouting across the meadows. Instead, he found silence. The farmhouses stood open to the wind. The churches were empty, their doors swinging. Cattle and sheep and goats wandered loose across the hills, gone half wild, nibbling at frost-burned grass, and not one human being remained to herd them. Ivar later wrote a line that still makes the back of your neck go cold 600 years later. There were no people there, he said, neither Christian nor heathen. An entire community of Norse farmers, the descendants of Vikings who had crossed the open ocean, had simply vanished into the cold, and the animals they left behind were the only witnesses. Nobody knows exactly what happened on those last winter nights. The most likely answer is the quietest and the most terrible one. The summers grew too short, the hay ran thin, the hunts failed, and one by one the fires in the longhouses went out. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. So drop your location and your local time in the comments, and we can all imagine one another scattered across the dark like little points of firelight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because tonight you are not going to vanish into the cold like that lost settlement. Tonight you are going to learn exactly how the Norse held the darkness back, night after freezing night, for 300 years. You're going to feel the wool against your skin, and the heat of a long fire on your face. And by the time we're done, you may find your own eyes growing heavy in the warm, safe glow of it. Let's begin at the beginning, with the thing that mattered more than gold, more than swords, more than the gods themselves. Let's begin with the fire. Imagine for a moment that you are there. You're standing at the door of a Viking longhouse on an evening in the month the Norse called Earlier, somewhere around the middle of what we would call December. The sun set hours ago, though set is a generous word this far north, where in deep winter the light barely lifts above the hills before sinking again. Your breath hangs in the air in front of your face. The cold is not a thing outside you anymore. It has crept into your fingers and your jaw and the small of your back, and it wants in. Behind you the fjord is black and still. Ahead of you, through a gap in a heavy woolen curtain, there is a low orange glow, and the smell of wood smoke and roasting barley and wet dog, and you push through and the warmth hits you like a wall. Historians still argue whether the average Viking longhouse was genuinely cosy or merely survivable, whether it was a snug golden hall or a smoky eye-watering box that simply kept you from dying, and the honest answer is probably that it was both at once, depending on the night and how close you sat to the flames. But you are inside now. You let the curtain fall shut behind you, and you begin to understand that survival, for these people, was not one heroic act. It was 1,000 small, patient, clever choices, repeated every single day, passed down from grandmother to grandchild, until holding off the cold became less a struggle and more a way of life. The fire in front of you is not a neat little fireplace tucked into a wall. It is a long trench of glowing coals running down the centre of the entire house, sometimes 15 or 20 feet of it, and the Norse had a word for it. The langelder, the long fire. It is the heart of the home in the most literal sense, because everything radiates outward from it. The heat, the light, the cooking, the talk, the stories, the very reason to gather at all. And keeping that long fire alive through the whole black stretch of winter was the single most important job any household had. Let it die on the wrong night and you might not get it back. So somebody was always tending it, always feeding it, always watching. Even as the household slept, the coals were banked and covered so a careful hand could wake them again at dawn. There is a small joke the Norse might have appreciated here, which is that the most feared warriors in Europe spent an enormous amount of their lives essentially babysitting a campfire. But that campfire was the difference between a living family and a settlement, like the one poor Ivar Bardason found standing empty in the snow. Now let your eyes adjust to the dimness and look up, past the smoke, at the house that is keeping you alive. The walls around you are thick, much thicker than you would expect. In many Norse homes they are built of turf, great blocks of earth and matted grass roots cut from the meadow and stacked like heavy bricks, sometimes packed in a double layer with loose soil and gravel poured into the middle. A wall like that can be a metre or more across, And earth, it turns out, is a superb blanket. It holds whatever warmth the fire gives it and gives it back slowly, through the night. Where good timber was plentiful, the walls might be wood instead, but even then they were often banked on the outside with turf and stone to seal the drafts. Above you, the roof is the same story, a heavy skin of turf laid over birch bark laid over rafters, so that from the outside a longhouse in winter looks less like a building and more like a long low hill with smoke leaking gently from its spine. Grass grew on those roofs in summer, and there are old jokes, probably true more often than not, about a farmer sending a goat up to graze on his own house. Historians still argue whether roof-grazing livestock was a common everyday sight or just the kind of story that got funnier each time it was told. But either way, the image is a good one to fall asleep to. A shaggy goat standing on a rooftop chewing, while the family below eats supper by the fire. Look at the shape of the ceiling now. It curves. The great longhouses were often built with a gentle bow to them, higher in the middle and lower at the ends, and this was not only for looks. That curve caught the rising heat of the long fire and rolled it back down along the underside of the roof, spreading it out over the whole room instead of letting it all rush straight up and out the smoke hole. The Norse did not have a physics textbook. They had a few hundred years of watching where the warmth went, and they built their houses to argue with the cold on every single point. There is only one hole in that roof directly above the fire, and it does two jobs. It lets the smoke escape, and it lets a little light in during the day. There is no chimney. A chimney, oddly enough, would have been worse, because it would have pulled the heat up and out far too efficiently. Instead, the smoke was allowed to gather in a lazy layer up near the rafters, where it did no harm to people sitting or lying low, and where, as a bonus, it slowly cured the fish, and meat hung up there to preserve them. You would have lived your whole winter in a house with a permanent grey ceiling of smoke hanging a few feet above your head, and you would have thought absolutely nothing of it. Your eyes might sting on a bad night. Your lungs, over a lifetime, paid a quiet price, but you were warm and you were alive, and those were the only two questions that winter ever asked. Now look down the length of the room, along both sides of the fire. The floor is packed earth, hard and swept, and running along each wall is a raised platform, a long bench of built-up earth or timber about knee-height. These benches were the most important furniture in the entire house, because they were everything at once. By day they were seats, workbenches and tables. By night they were beds. The whole family slept up on those platforms, lifted off the cold ground, wrapped in wool and furs, arranged in a row along the warm walls with the banked fire glowing between them. The higher you slept and the closer to the centre, the warmer you were, and so there was a quiet geography of status and age in exactly where you laid your head. The master and mistress of the house took the best positions. Guests were honoured or insulted by where they were placed, and the floor between the benches, strewn thick with straw and rushes and sweet-dried herbs, softened the tread of your feet and soaked up the endless mess of a house where cooking, working and living all happened in one long shared room. There is a certain genius in it that you only really feel when you imagine lying there yourself. The fire a low red line down the middle of the world, the turf walls breathing warmth at your back, the smoke drifting far above, the sound of a dozen people you have known your whole life breathing slow around you in the dark. It was crowded, it was smoky, it smelled, frankly, of everything. But it was on the coldest night of the year one of the safest places a human being could possibly be, and the Norse built it with their own hands out of the very ground they stood on. There is a sound you have been half hearing this whole time, under the crackle of the fire and the murmur of voices, and now you notice it properly. The soft shift and stamp of animals. Because at the far end of this longhouse, sometimes behind a low partition, and sometimes in the same open room, live the cattle. In the coldest parts of the Norse world, the family and the livestock wintered under one roof, and this was not carelessness or poverty. It was strategy. A single cow gives off a remarkable amount of heat, roughly as much as a small stove burning steadily all night, and a byre with several beasts in it becomes a gentle furnace that warms the whole building from one end. You kept your animals close in winter for the same reason you kept your fire close, because their warmth was your warmth, and a frozen cow was a dead cow, and a dead cow in December was a family that would not see spring. So the two ends of the longhouse struck a bargain across the smoky air. The people gave the animals shelter from the killing wind. The animals gave the people their body heat and, come morning, their milk. Historians still argue whether the smell of this arrangement was as unbearable as we imagine, or simply the ordinary background of a life nobody thought twice about, and I will let you make up your own mind as you lie there in the dark. breathing in the imagined mix of wood smoke, wet wool, warm cattle and simmering stew. My own guess is that after about a week you would not have smelled it at all. Keeping those animals alive through winter, though, was its own long war, and it was a war you had to win months in advance, in the golden light of late summer, swinging a scythe until your shoulders screamed. Because the real enemy was not the cold itself. The real enemy was hay. Every cow, every sheep, every goat you wanted to keep through the winter had to be fed every single day for months, and there was nothing green growing to feed them. So all summer the whole household cut grass, dried it and stacked it, racing the weather, because a wet summer that ruined the hay harvest was a death sentence that arrived slowly, in January when the fodder ran out and the animals began to starve in their stalls. This is almost certainly part of what killed that lost Greenland settlement. A run of bad summers, snow lying late on the fields, not enough hay in the barn, and then a long dark winter with hungry animals and nothing to give them. So the Norse did the hard arithmetic every autumn. They counted their hay, and they counted their animals, and they killed the difference. The very first month of winter in the old calendar was called Gormanudur, which means, with brutal honesty, slaughter month. This was when you butchered every animal you could not afford to feed, until spring, the old, the surplus, the ones you had quietly decided would not make it anyway. It sounds grim, and it was, but it was also the most abundant, feast-heavy time of the whole year, because suddenly there was fresh meat everywhere, more than could ever be eaten before it spoiled, and so the killing and the celebrating went hand in hand. You worked yourself to exhaustion with blood to your elbows, and then you ate like a king, and then you got to work preserving everything that was left, because that meat had to last until the world turned green again. There is a dark little joke buried in the Norse name for the next month too. After Slaughter Month and after Yule came Mersugur, which translates to something like the fat-sucking month, or the marrow-sucking month, the deep midwinter stretch when the fresh feasting was long over and you were down to gnawing every last scrap of fat and marrow out of the bones you had saved. The very names of the months tell you the shape of the winter. It began in blood and plenty and ended in careful, bone-scraping hunger, and everyone knew it, and they named their calendar after it so that no one could ever pretend to be surprised. You, standing here in the warm middle of a leer with the smell of roast meat still in the air, are at the good part. The hard part is coming, the way it always came, and the whole clever machine of the longhouse, the turf walls, the long fire, the sleeping benches, the animals at the far end, the smoke curing the food overhead, existed for one reason only, to carry every soul under this roof, human and animal alike, across the long black bridge of winter and set them down safe on the other side in spring. That was the whole game. And more often than not, for 300 years, across islands and fjords and frozen coasts, the Norse won it. Let's talk about what you're wearing, because you did not walk in from that black fjord in a thin shirt and survive. The Norse dressed for winter the way a good cook builds a stew, in patient, deliberate layers, each one doing a job. Against your skin, first, is a shift of linen, cool and smooth and easy to wash, because linen breathes and does not itch and can be boiled clean. Over that goes the real workhorse of the entire Norse wardrobe, the thing that mattered so much it is almost impossible to overstate: wool. A long-sleeved woolen tunic, the kirtil belted at the waist, falling past your hips. Then woolen trousers, or for a woman a heavy woolen overdress worn over the linen shift and pinned at the shoulders with a pair of oval brooches. And over all of it, when you step out into the wind, a thick woolen cloak, often lined or trimmed with fur, thrown across your shoulders and fastened at the collarbone with a single sturdy pin or a ring-shaped brooch. Now here is the piece of genius, and it is the reason wool was worth more than almost anything the Norse could weave. Wool keeps you warm even when it is wet. Soak a linen shirt, or God forbid a modern cotton one, and it turns into a cold, clammy sheet that pulls the heat straight out of your body, which is precisely how people freeze to death. But wool, because of the crimped, scaly structure of each fibre, traps little pockets of air even when damp, and it goes on holding your warmth long after it has been rained on, snowed on, or sweated through. In a world of wet snow and sea spray and sudden thaws, a fabric that kept working when it was soaked was not a luxury. It was the difference between coming home and not coming home. The Norse knew this in their bones, and they built their entire cold-weather life around the sheep. Look closer at your own hands and feet, because this is where the cold hunts hardest and where the Norse were cleverest. On your feet are shoes or low boots of leather, turned and stitched, and inside them thick woolen socks. But not socks knitted the way we knit. Knitting had not reached them yet. These were made by a slower, older craft called null-binding, needle binding, a kind of looping done with a single blunt needle and a short length of yarn, which produced a dense, stretchy, marvellously warm fabric that did not unravel when it snagged. Socks, mittens, and snug caps all came off that one bone needle, made in the long dark evenings by the fire while stories were told. On your head is a woolen or fur cap, because a startling amount of your warmth escapes from an uncovered head, and the Norse were not sentimental about vanity when the alternative was frostbite, and that great cloak on your shoulders has a second life you might not expect. When the day was done and you climbed up onto the sleeping bench, the very same cloak that had shielded you from the wind became your blanket, wrapped around you with the furs. Nothing was single purpose. Nothing was wasted. A Viking's cloak worked the day shift and the night shift both. There is a gentle joke to be found in the fact that the fiercest raiders of the age, the men who terrified the monasteries of Europe, owed a genuine debt of their survival to sheep and to the patient women bent over needle and wool by the firelight, that behind every legend in polished mail there was a grandmother turning fleece into the socks that kept his feet from turning black. And here is a quirky little tidbit to tuck under your pillow tonight. The Norse were not drab. We picture them in gloomy browns and greys, but they loved colour, and they dyed their wool in rich shades wherever they could, deep reds from madder root, warm yellows from weld, blues from woad, greens and browns and purples coaxed out of plants and lichens and shellfish. A well-off Viking on a feast night could be a genuinely colourful sight, wrapped in a red cloak trimmed with fur, a bright tunic, fine woven trim at the cuffs and hem, and glinting brooches of bronze or silver. Historians still argue over just how bright the everyday Norse really went, and how much dye an ordinary farmer could afford. But the loom weights and dye traces they leave behind lean, again and again, toward a people who liked their winters warm and their clothes anything but dull. So there you are, dressed head to foot in the quiet triumph of the wool trade. All linen against the skin, wool for the warmth, fur at the edges, and every fibre of it made by hand, you know, in this very room, on nights exactly like this one. Comfortable, aren't you? Good. Stay there. We're only getting started and the fire is not going anywhere. Somewhere over your head, up in that layer of drifting smoke, hangs tonight's supper and also next month's, and the months after that. Preserving food was the second great pillar of surviving a Norse winter, standing right beside the fire itself, because it did not matter how warm your house was if the pantry ran dry in February, and the Norse were, quite simply, masters of it. They had to be. They lived in a place where nothing grew for half the year, and so they turned the whole abundance of summer and autumn, the fish runs, the slaughter, the milk, the grain, into food that would keep patiently in the cold and the dark until it was needed. The most famous of all their methods was drying, and the most famous dried food was fish. Along the coasts, when the cod came in their countless thousands, people split them, gutted them, and hung them in pairs over long wooden racks out in the freezing wind, where the cold, dry air pulled the moisture out of them without ever letting them rot. What was left was stockfish, hard as a plank, light as kindling, and nearly immortal. Properly made stockfish could keep for years, not months, and it could be stacked in a storehouse, or loaded onto a ship and carried across an ocean. You did not so much cut it as beat it, then soak it back to life in water before cooking. A coastal Norse family might dry enough fish in a good autumn to eat through the entire winter and still have plenty left. To trade. It is no exaggeration to say that the dried cod on those windy racks was one of the quiet engines of the whole Viking world. Then there was salt. Precious and laborious to produce, boiled down from seawater over yet more fire, and used to pack meat and fish into barrels where the salt drew the water out, and made a place where nothing could spoil. There was smoking, done in the rafters over the long fire, which is why your dinner has been hanging in the smoke all along, slowly taking on that dark, keeping flavour. And then there was the method that sounds strangest to modern ears, and was perhaps the most important of all in the far north: fermentation, and above all the magic the Norse worked with sour milk. Here is a fact to marvel at as you drift. When the Norse made their beloved skyr, a thick, tangy, yogurt-like curd that is still eaten in Iceland to this day, more than 1,000 years later, they were left with a great deal of sour whey, which they called misa. And instead of throwing it away, they discovered that this sour whey was itself a preservative. Cuts of meat, sausages, even boiled sheep's heads could be dropped into a barrel of that acidic whey and kept there for months, sealed away from rot, souring gently into something that would carry a family deep into the hungry part of winter. It is a preservation method that works, that is still practiced in corners of Scandinavia, and that turned a waste product into a lifeline. Historians still argue about exactly how central side foods were to the ordinary Norse diet versus the dried and salted staples, but there is no argument that a people who could turn leftover way into a winter meat locker were doing something genuinely brilliant with very little. Not everything hung in the smoke or floated in whey. Down below the frost line, or built into cool, earth-covered pits and small turf storehouses, the Norse kept what the ground gave them: turnips, carrots, cabbages, onions, dried peas and beans, and where they could get them, apples and berries. Grain was stored dry and ground as needed into flour for the flat, heavy barley bread that was the daily bread of the north. Butter was salted and packed away by the tubful. So much of it that hordes of ancient bog butter still turn up in Scandinavian and Irish peat to this day, buried and preserved for 1,000 years and more. There is a comedy to imagine in a Viking's winter larder, a place hung with plank-stiff fish, lined with barrels of soured mutton, stacked with tubs of green gold butter and sacks of grain, and a faint permanent haze of smoke over all of it. But every single item in it was a small victory over starvation, laid up in the good months by people who never once forgot that the cold was coming. And so, as you sit by the fire tonight, warm and fed, understand that this meal did not begin today. It began last spring, when the first grass came, and ran all through the summer of scything and the autumn of slaughter and salting and drying, and it will stretch, if the household did its arithmetic right, all the way to the far green shore of next year. The Norse did not survive winter in winter. They survived it in advance. Now let's talk about the darkness, because the cold was only half the enemy. The other half was the dark, and in the Norse lands it was a darkness that modern people, with our streetlights and our glowing screens, can barely imagine. The Norse had a word for this stretch of the year, skamdegi, the short days. And the further north you lived, the shorter those days became, until in the very far north the sun did not rise at all for weeks on end. Picture a whole month where the closest thing to daylight is a bruised, bluish twilight that gathers weakly around noon and then gives up. Picture waking, working, eating and sleeping almost entirely by firelight for weeks. That was winter for the Norse, and it did things to the body and the mind that they understood in their own way long before anyone had words like seasonal darkness or the science of it. So how did you light the long night, once the fire alone was not enough to see by? You reached for the lamp. The Norse carved small, shallow lamps out of soapstone, a soft greyish rock they could hollow into a bowl, and into that bowl they poured fish oil or rendered animal fat, and laid a twist of plant fibre or moss as a wick and lit it. It was not bright. A soapstone lamp gives a small, steady, golden pool of light, enough to find your way across a dark room, enough to work fine handcraft close up, enough to keep the shadows in the corners from feeling quite so total. In a wealthy hall there might be many of them, and torches of resinous pinewood besides, and beeswax or tallow candles for the well-off. But for most people, most nights, light was precious and rationed, and you lived in a warm gloom lit by fire and by the little, floating flames of oil lamps, and your eyes, over a lifetime, grew far better at seeing in the dark than yours or mine will ever be. There is a strange coziness to it that comes through even now. We spend money and effort trying to recreate exactly this: the low golden light, the flicker, the soft edges, the hush. We call it ambience. The Norse called it Tuesday. Historians still argue about how heavily the long darkness weighed on the Norse spirit, whether the saga's fondness for ghosts and restless dead and things that walk in the winter night grew straight out of those endless black months, or whether that is us reading our own moods back into them. But it is hard not to notice how many Norse stories take place in the deep of winter, how many hauntings and hardest fates fall in the dark half of the year, and how the great feasts and fires were set precisely at midwinter, at the very bottom of the darkness, as if to push back against it with light and noise and company all at once. And that is the real answer to how they endured the dark, not with lamps, though the lamps helped, but with each other. The long winter nights were when the household drew tight around the fire, and did all the things that a scattered, busy summer left no time for. This was the season of craft, of the hands never being still. Men carved and repaired tools, mended nets, whittled, worked leather and bone. Women spun wool into thread on the drop spindle, wove at the great upright loom that leaned against the wall, sewed and turned fleece into the socks and mittens and cloaks that everyone's survival depended on. Children learned by watching and doing, and over all of it, filling the hours, ran the talk and the telling. The winter was the great season of stories. Around that long fire in that golden gloom, the Norse told the tales we still have echoes of today, the deeds of gods and giants, the sly tricks of Loki, the doom that waits at the end of the world, the feuds and voyages and killings of their own great-grandparents, remembered in astonishing detail and handed down by voice alone. A skilled teller could hold a whole longhouse spellbound for an entire evening, and the best of these tales were polished and repeated across so many winters that they eventually became the sagas, written down generations later, that let us sit here tonight and know these people at all. So the darkness, in the end, was not only something to be endured, it was also oddly a gift. The one time of year when there was nothing to do but be together, warm in the light of a fire, telling one another who they were. And if that sounds like the coziest thing in the world, a room full of people you love, a fire, a story, and nowhere in the frozen world you need to be, well, it was. Let that be the thing you carry as your own eyes start to feel the pull of the dark. The Norse were not only surviving those nights. Some of those nights, warm and fed and safe among their own, they were happy. To survive a winter, it helps enormously to know how long it is, and the Norse divided their year not into 4 seasons as we do, but into 2 great halves, summer and winter, with winter beginning not in December but far earlier, around the middle of October, at a threshold they marked with a festival called the Winter Nights, in the old tongue, Veternetter. This was the door you walked through into the dark half of the year, and the Norse did not slip through it quietly. They marked it with a feast, a sacrifice, and a gathering, a last great communal breath before the long cold closed over the land. The winter nights fell just after the harvest was in and the slaughter was underway, which meant it landed at a moment of sudden, almost overwhelming plenty, meat and drink everywhere, the barns full, the work of the summer finally done, and the Norse used that plenty to fortify themselves, body and soul, for what was coming. There was a blot, a sacrifice, in which animals were offered to the gods and to the land spirits, and especially at this time of year, to the Disir, the female guardian spirits and ancestral mothers of the family, whose favour was thought to protect the household through the winter. The meat of the sacrifice became the feast. Ale and mead flowed. There were games and contests and long nights of drinking and boasting and remembering the dead. And underneath the celebration ran a very practical purpose, because a festival like this pulled the scattered farms of a district together, reminded everyone of the bonds and debts and friendships that they would lean on if the winter turned cruel, and sent every family back to its own fire, knowing it was not entirely alone in the dark. That is a kind of survival technology too. Not a wall or a fire or a barrel of salted fish, but the simple, sturdy knowledge that your neighbours were out there, and that you were all facing the same night. The very act of naming and numbering the winter was its own quiet comfort. The Norse gave each of the winter months a name that told you exactly where you stood in the long crossing. First came Gormanudur, slaughter month, the bloody, feast-heavy beginning we have already met. Then Elir, the month of Yule, carrying the great midwinter celebration in its heart. Then Mersugur, the fat-sucking month, the deep lean middle when the feasting was spent and you gnawed the marrow from the bones. Then Thori, the frozen snow month, the coldest, hardest stretch of all, named as if it were a person. Old Man Thori, the spirit of the killing frost. Then Goa, named as Thori's daughter, a softening, the first hint that the worst had passed. And finally Einmanudur, the lone month, the last single stretch of winter before summer returned, named for its loneliness at the tail end of the cold. 6 months, each with a face and a name, each a milestone you could count off as you crossed. There is real psychological genius in that. Whether the Norse designed it on purpose or simply grew it over generations. When you're in the middle of something hard and dark and long, the worst thing is not knowing how much more of it there is. But if you know that you are in Thori now, and that after Thori comes Goa, and after Goa the lone month, and after the lone month the grass, then the darkness has edges, it has a shape. It will end on a day with a name, and you can hold on until then. Historians still argue about exactly how the Old Norse calendar was reckoned, how they kept it aligned with the sun and moon, how much of what we know comes from later Icelandic writing rather than the Viking age itself. But the deep logic of it, the 2 halves, the named months, the festival at the threshold of the dark comes through clear and human across all those centuries. And there is a small joke in the fact that the single coldest, most miserable month of the Norse year Thori is the one they chose to throw another feast in the middle of, the midwinter Thorrablot still celebrated in Iceland today, where people gather in the teeth of the frost to eat determinedly challenging traditional foods and drink and be warm together, essentially daring the winter to do its worst. It is a very Norse solution to being cold and hungry and sick of the dark. You do not sit quietly and endure it. You throw a party at it. So as you lie there, imagine the whole shape of it laid out. The door of the winter night swinging shut behind you in October, and then the long march through the named months, feast to lean time to, killing frost to the first soft thaw, every step numbered, every ending promised in advance. The Norse could not make the winter shorter, but they could make it knowable and shared, and marked with fires of celebration at its darkest points, and that more than almost anything is how a people keeps its heart through a long cold night. And now we come to the brightest fire in the whole dark winter, the one the Norse lit at the very bottom of the year, Yule. In the old tongue it was Jol, and it fell in the heart of midwinter, in the deepest cold and the shortest days, precisely when a people might be forgiven for losing hope. That is exactly why it was there. Yule was the great midwinter feast, days long, a deliberate blaze of light and food and drink and company, set against the darkest point of the turning year, and so much of what you and I still do in December. The feasting, the drinking, the greenery brought indoors, the gathering of family, the fires and lights against the dark, comes down to us, in part from what the Norse and their neighbours did at Jol 1,000 years ago and more. It was a time when work stopped as far as it possibly could. The animals were fed, the fire was kept, and everything else that could wait, waited, while the household turned to celebration. There was drinking, and this was serious business. Ale and mead brewed and hoarded for exactly this, poured out generously, because to drink together in the deep of winter was to affirm that you had made it this far and meant to make it the rest of the way. There were toasts, formal and heartfelt, raised to the gods, to absent friends, to the dead, to the coming of a good year. And there were oaths. The Norse had a custom of swearing solemn vows at the Yule feast, sometimes with a hand laid on a sacred boar brought before the company, promises of great deeds to be accomplished in the year ahead, a tradition that, if you squint, is the distant grandfather of our own habit of making resolutions over the midwinter holidays, and probably kept about as well. The boar itself points back to Freya, the god of fruitfulness and good seasons and peace, and a roasted boar or pork in some form was a fitting centrepiece for a feast that was, at its root, a prayer for the return of plenty. Food was the language of Yule. After the lean discipline of preserving and rationing, this was the moment to open the stores and eat well. Roasted and boiled meat from the autumn slaughter, rich and fatty, bread, butter, cheese, whatever the household had laid by that could be spared for a great occasion. To feast hard at midwinter was not gluttony. It was a statement of confidence, a way of insisting to the cold and the dark and the hungry gods that this house was strong, this house had plenty, this house would live. Historians still argue about how much of our modern Christmas is genuinely descended from Norse Yule, and how much is later invention layered on top, how much the Yule log and the drinking and the midwinter greenery owe to the Vikings specifically, versus the broader web of old European midwinter customs. But nobody disputes that the Norse held a mighty festival at exactly this darkest hinge of the year, and that its whole purpose was to carry the human spirit across the bottom of the winter and out the far side. There is a lovely detail worth falling asleep on. Deep midwinter, the Norse seemed to have felt, was a thin time, a season when the boundary between the ordinary world and the other worlds grew soft, when the dead might walk, when Odin himself was said to ride across the winter sky at the head of a wild host of spirits and the slain, a thundering ghostly hunt sweeping over the frozen land in the long nights. It was a season to keep your fire bright and your door shut and your family close, not only against the cold, but against everything the dark might carry. And yet the answer to all of that dread was the same as ever. More light, more warmth, more people, more feasting. The fire built high and the hall full and loud, the darkness pushed back to the very walls and no further. There is a joke to be found in how little the fundamental human plan has changed. It is the coldest, darkest, most difficult stretch of the entire year. Morale is low, the work is grinding, the sun has all but vanished, and the collective decision of an entire civilization is, essentially, let us gather everyone we love into the warmest room we have, cook far too much food, drink too much, tell stories, make promises we probably won't keep, and stay up late in the firelight until we feel like ourselves again. We still do it. We just have better heating. So when you picture the coldest night of the Norse year, do not only picture hardship, Picture the hall at Yule, the long fire blazing, the boards heavy with meat, horns of ale going round, an old man on his feet swearing some magnificent vow he will regret in the morning, a child asleep against a warm dog, and outside the shut door the whole dark frozen world held at bay for one more turning of the year. That is not survival as mere endurance. That is survival as joy, deliberately made in the teeth of the dark. Here is something that would have surprised the rest of medieval Europe, and might surprise you. The Vikings were clean. Famously, almost scandalously clean by the standards of their day. While a good deal of Christian Europe regarded bathing with suspicion, the Norse bathed regularly, combed their hair and beards with combs of bone and antler that they carried everywhere and treasured, and set aside an entire day of the week for washing. Their word for Saturday, lugudag, means something close to washing day or bath day, and its descendants still sit in the Scandinavian calendars today, a small linguistic fossil of a whole people's weekly habit of getting properly clean. And in the depth of winter, that habit was not just about being presentable. Heat, steam, and hot water were survival too. In many parts of the Norse world, the bath was a steam bath, a small, tightly built structure, or a corner of the household, where stones were heated in a fire until they glowed and then had water thrown over them to fill the room with a thick, scalding, blessed cloud of steam. You sat in that heat and let it soak all the way into your bones, the deep ache of the cold driven out of you for the first time in days, your muscles loosening, your skin flushing, the grime and the tension of a hard winter's work sweating away. Then, in the boldest version of the ritual, you burst out of the steam and into the snow, or plunged into a freezing river or the icy sea, and then back into the heat again. The same hot and cold cycle that Scandinavians still swear by in their saunas to this day, 1,000 years later, because it works, because it leaves you tingling and warm and wildly alive. Nowhere was this easier or more wonderful than in Iceland, where the Norse settlers found a land laced with natural hot springs, water heated by the fire deep in the earth and bubbling up warm and steaming into the freezing air for free. They bathed in these pools, gathered at them, and some of the most famous events in the Icelandic sagas happen at or around the hot springs, where people met to talk and wash and warm themselves in the open even as the winter pressed down all around. To lower your whole cold, stiffened body into naturally hot water while snow falls on your face and steam rises around you is one of the great pleasures a human being can have, and the Norse of Iceland had it on tap in the middle of the North Atlantic winter, and they knew exactly how lucky they were. Historians still argue about how widespread and how elaborate Norse steam bathing really was across all the different Viking lands. How much was everyday practice and how much was the privilege of the well-off with the fuel and the space to spare, and how much of the sauna tradition belongs to the broader North rather than to the Vikings alone. But the bath day and the calendar and the combs in every grave and the horror of foreign chroniclers at how attractive and well-groomed these northerners were leave very little doubt that cleanliness was woven deep into Norse life, winter and summer alike. There is a delightful, slightly grumpy piece of evidence for all this. An English writer, centuries later, complained that the Danish men living in England were stealing the hearts of English women, and the reason he gave was that they combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes often, and so made themselves far too appealing. It is one of the earliest recorded complaints in history of a rival group being unfairly good-looking and well-groomed, and it tells you that the Norse reputation for cleanliness reached far beyond their own shores. Picture the scene then, on a bitter night in Thorry, the frozen snow month, the very coldest stretch. You have spent the short grey day hauling fodder to hungry animals with numb hands, mending, working, your body clenched against the cold for hours. And then, in the evening, you step into the steam. The heat wraps around you, total and merciful, and for a while there is no winter at all, only warmth and water and the quiet company of your household, everyone loosening, everyone easing, the endless tension of the cold finally letting go of your shoulders. Afterward you are clean and warm to the core, and you climb up onto the sleeping bench by the banked fire with your skin still glowing, and you sleep the deep sleep of a body that has for one night truly been warm all the way through. It is a small thing and an enormous thing at once. The Norse could not escape their winter, but they found, in steam and hot water and the simple discipline of keeping clean, a way to make peace with it a little, to give the body a regular reprieve, to stay not just alive, but human and comfortable and even, on a good bath night, thoroughly content. Let that warmth reach you now, wherever you are lying. Imagine the steam, the heat sinking in, the cold finally letting go. Let's talk now about sleep itself, because you are, I hope, getting closer to it, and because how the Norse slept through the coldest nights is a small masterpiece of practical warmth. We have already met the sleeping benches, those raised platforms of earth and timber running along the walls on either side of the long fire. That was where most people slept, up off the killing cold of the ground, close to the wall that had been soaking up the fire's heat all evening. But the bench was only the foundation. What went on top of it was the real art. First, insulation from below, because cold comes up through a bed as surely as it comes, down from a roof. Straw, hay, heather, and reeds were piled and packed to make a springy warm mattress, sometimes stuffed into a cloth cover, sometimes simply heaped loose. Heather in particular was prized for bedding. Spring it right, and a mattress of heather is soft, faintly fragrant and warm. On top of that went woven woolen blankets, and on top of those the furs. Sheepskins, goatskins, the pelts of bears and reindeer and whatever else the hunt or the trade had brought. Heavy and gloriously warm, and layered thick over the whole family. The very same cloaks that had been worn against the wind by day were pulled up as covers by night, and then everyone climbed in together. This is the part our modern, private, one-person-per-blanket world has forgotten, but it was the beating heart of how the Norse stayed warm after dark. They slept close. Families huddled together on the benches, parents and children and often servants and guests all in a row along the warm walls, and every warm body added to the heat of the whole. 2 people under a pile of furs are far warmer than 1. A whole family is a furnace. The Norse were not squeamish about this, and they were not cold. Between the fire banked low in the centre, the heat still radiating from the turf walls, the deep pile of furs, and the warmth of the bodies pressed close beneath them, a Norse bed on the coldest night of the year could be a genuinely snug place. An island of heat in a frozen house in a frozen land. In the grander halls, the most important people might have something closer to a real bed, a wooden frame with proper posts sometimes beautifully carved, raised and dressed with the best furs and finest woven covers the household owned. Some had bed closets, small enclosed sleeping nooks with panels or curtains that could be shut, trapping the warmth of the sleeper's own body in a tiny private box against the general cold of the hall. To lie in a shut bed closet under a mound of furs, your own breath slowly warming the little wooden space around you, the muffled sounds of the sleeping household beyond the panel, that was about as warm and safe as a winter night got, and it was a comfort reserved, as comfort so often is, for those with the standing to claim it. And there was one more source of warmth in the bed that I have been saving, because it is the cosiest of all, the dog. The Norse kept dogs, valued and loved them, buried them sometimes with real tenderness, and on a cold night, a dog is a marvellous thing to have under the furs, a living, breathing heat source with a heartbeat, curled against your legs or your back, radiating warmth and comfort all night long. Anyone who has slept with a dog against them on a cold night knows exactly the kind of warmth I mean, and knows that it is not only the body heat, but the deep animal comfort of another creature choosing to be close to you in the dark. The Norse knew it too, 1,000 years ago, on the coldest nights of the year. Historians still argue about the finer details of Norse sleeping arrangements, how common the enclosed bed really was, how the household sorted itself along the benches, how much privacy anyone had or wanted. But the broad picture is warm and clear. They slept lifted off the cold ground, insulated below and buried above, packed close together for shared heat, with the fire banked between them, and, more often than not, a dog somewhere in the pile. There is nothing lonely in it. A Norse winter night was many hard things, but it was almost never a night spent cold and alone, and that, in the end, may be the gentlest truth of this whole story. For all the fires and the wool and the salted fish and the clever turf walls, the deepest warmth the Norse had against the coldest nights of the year was one another. Bodies close under the furs, breath rising into the dark, the whole household a single warm knot of life in the middle of the frozen world, sleeping and safe and together, waiting for the slow return of the light. So let your own breathing slow now, and imagine it. The weight of the furs, the heat of the wall at your back, the soft sounds of people you love, breathing all around you in the dark. Let's return to the fire, because we have talked about how much it mattered, but not about the anxious, everyday work of never, ever letting it go out. In a world with no matches, no lighter, no easy flame at the flick of a thumb, starting a fire from cold was slow, difficult work, and on a wet winter night with numb fingers it could be nearly impossible. So the real skill was not making fire, it was keeping it. Every night the last thing done before sleep was to bank the coals. to rake the glowing embers together into a heap and cover them over with ash, which choked the fire down to a slow smoulder that would not blaze and would not die, but would sit there breathing quietly through the whole long night. And every morning the first task, often the work of the woman of the house before anyone else had stirred, was to uncover those coals, feed them a breath of dry tinder, blow gently, and coax the household fire back to life. A fire kept this way could burn continuously for weeks, months, even years, and there is real evidence that some Norse households prized a hearth fire that had, in a sense, never gone out at all, passed from banking to waking day after day as an unbroken thread of flame at the centre of the home. When you did need to strike a new flame, you reached for flint and fire steel. A shard of flint struck hard against a curved piece of iron throws a shower of tiny sparks, and those sparks were caught in a nest of the driest, finest tinder you could keep. Shredded bark, dried fungus, teased out plant fluff, sometimes a special tinder fungus that catches a spark and holds it as a glowing coal. You caught the spark, breathed it into a glow, folded it into your tinder nest and blew gently and steadily, coaxing the faint red ember into smoke, and then, if the gods and your dry kindling were kind, into a small licking flame you could feed into a proper fire. Every household kept its fire steel and its flint and its hoard of bone-dry tinder as carefully as any tool it owned, because that little kit was, quite literally, the difference between warmth and death on a night when the fire failed. And then there was fuel, which was not the small problem you might think. A long fire burning through a 6-month winter eats an astonishing amount of wood, and not everywhere in the Norse world had wood to spare. In the well-forested parts of Scandinavia, you cut and split and stacked cordwood all through the warmer months, seasoning it dry under cover, laying up a great woodpile that was as much a measure of a household's winter readiness as its barn of hay or its store of fish. But in the treeless places, much of Iceland, the coast of Greenland, the wind-scoured islands, wood was scarce and precious, and people burned whatever the land gave them. They burned peat, cut from the bogs in summer and dried into dense brown blocks that smoulder with a low, steady, smoky heat for hours. They burned dried animal dung, which sounds grim but burns perfectly well and warmed a great many northern homes. They scavenged driftwood from the beaches, timber carried across the whole ocean by the currents and flung up on the shore, so valuable in a treeless land that the right to gather driftwood from a stretch of coast was a genuine form of wealth that people owned and argued over and passed down. Historians still argue about just how tight the fuel supply became in the hardest-pressed Norse colonies, and whether a slow crisis of firewood and fodder was part of what doomed the Greenland settlements in the end. The cold closing in, the driftwood and the peat never quite enough, the fires harder and harder to keep fed through longer and colder winters. It is a quiet, plausible, chilling thought, and it puts the daily work of banking the coals in its true light. There is a small joke in imagining the fearsome Viking coming home from a raid, hanging up his sword and immediately being handed the far more important and less glamorous duty of making absolutely sure the fire does not go out overnight, but it is only barely a joke, because that was the real hierarchy of a northern winter. The sword won you plunder, the banked coals won you tomorrow, and a household that treated its fire with anything less than total, unbroken vigilance was a household gambling with its own survival every single night. So as you drift, picture the last small ritual of the Norse day. The coals raked into a glowing heap, the soft grey ash drawn over them like a blanket, the faint red breathing warmth into the dark, and someone's careful hand making sure, one more time, that the heart of the house would still be beating in the morning. Then, and only then, everyone slept. Come back to the fire now, because it is time to eat. And the Norse winter table, though plain, was warm and filling and built to keep a working body going through the cold. Most days began and ended with 2 meals rather than 3. The dagmal, the day meal in the morning, and the nattmal, the night meal in the evening. And in between there was work, and hunger was simply carried. The great everyday staple, the food that anchored the winter diet, was porridge and stew, because a pot hung over the long fire could simmer all day, turning stored grain, dried peas, salted meat, and preserved vegetables into something hot and hearty with almost no attention. Barley was the grain of the north, boiled into thick porridge or ground and baked on a flat stone or iron griddle into dense, chewy flatbreads that kept for days. Into the great soapstone or iron cauldron went whatever the stores could spare, a handful of grain, dried peas and beans, a lump of salted or soured meat, a few roots, herbs for flavour, and water, all cooked down into a thick, sustaining stew that was ladled into wooden bowls and eaten with bread and butter and cheese. It was not fancy. It was hot, and there was, in a well-run household, enough of it. And on a freezing night that is worth more than any delicacy. And to drink, there was ale. The Norse brewed ale from their barley in great quantities, and it was not the strong stuff of a modern pub so much as an everyday drink. A thin, nourishing, mildly alcoholic brew that was safer than much standing water, full of the goodness of the grain and drunk by everyone, including children in weaker forms. Brewing was a regular part of the household's work. The malting and mashing and fermenting of barley into ale, a skill as essential as baking bread, and a good brew was a matter of real pride. For special occasions and for those who could afford it, there was mead, the honey wine of the north, sweet and strong and bound up with poetry and the gods themselves, for the Norse told that the very gift of poetry was a magical mead, and there was milk when the animal still gave it, and the tangy thinned skyr and soured whey drinks that carried the goodness of the dairy through the winter. Water itself the Norse were rightly a little wary of, for standing water could sicken you, and so much of what they drank was brewed or soured or fresh from a running spring. Cooking in that one-room smoky world was a constant low background thing, and the smells of it were the smell of the house, the porridge bubbling, the bread on the griddle, the meat and fish in the smoke overhead, the sharp tang of the soured stores, all mingled with the wood smoke and the wool and the warm animals. There is a real comfort in imagining it. The great pot murmuring over the coals through the short grey day, someone stirring it now and then, the promise of a hot bowl at the end of the cold work. Historians still argue about the finer points of the Norse diet, how much meat an ordinary family really ate versus grain and dairy, how the balance shifted between the rich and the poor and between a good year and a lean one, how much fish versus livestock in different regions. But the shape of the winter table is clear enough. Hot grain, preserved meat and fish, dairy in its keeping forms, dense dark bread, butter and cheese and ale to wash it down, all simmered and served around the one great fire that cooked it and warmed the eaters both. There is a small homely joke in the fact that the terror of the northern seas, the raider whose name emptied villages, came home to a supper of barley porridge and flatbread and a horn of weak ale, eaten from a wooden bowl by the fire, and was, in all likelihood, perfectly happy with it. Glory is glory, but a hot bowl on a cold night is a hot bowl on a cold night, and the Norse understood the deep value of the second thing as well as anyone who has ever lived. So picture yourself taking that bowl now, the warmth of it soaking into your cold hands, the steam rising into your face, the first mouthful spreading heat through your chest. Around you the household eats in the firelight, tired from the day's work, quiet or talking softly. The dogs hopeful at the edges. Outside the wind is doing what the winter wind does, but in here there is hot food and ale and light and company, and the pot still has more in it, and no one is going hungry tonight. That is what the whole vast machinery of preserving and storing and rationing was for. This, exactly this. A hot bowl in warm hands on a freezing night, repeated faithfully night after night, all the way across the winter. Eat. Be warm. Let the day's cold finally leave you. Now let's step outside for a little while. Well wrapped, don't worry, because surviving winter was not only about staying still and warm. Sometimes you had to move across it to reach a neighbour, to hunt, to trade, to carry news, and the Norse had a genuinely brilliant set of answers to the problem of a world buried in snow and ice. The first and finest of these was the ski. The peoples of the north had been sliding across the snow on long wooden runners for thousands of years before the Viking Age, and the Norse were expert at it, so much so that they had a god of skiing, Ulla, a deity of the bow and the ski in the winter, invoked by those who travelled the frozen wilds. A pair of skis turned deep, exhausting impassable snow into a surface you could glide over swiftly, covering ground in a winter's day that would have been unthinkable on foot, and for hunters and messengers and anyone who had to cross the white country in the cold months, skis were not sport but transport, as ordinary and essential as a boat in summer. There were snowshoes too, and simpler bindings that spread your weight so you did not sink to your waist with every step. And then there were the skates, which are one of those small historical details that delight everyone who hears them. The Norse skated on ice using skates made from the leg bones of horses or cattle, smoothed and strapped to the feet. You did not push with the edge as a modern skater does. Instead, you carried a pole and pushed yourself along the ice with it, gliding on the polished bone, skimming across a frozen lake or river where in summer you would have had to walk all the way around. Thousands of these bone skates have been dug up across the Norse world, worn smooth by long dead feet, and they are a lovely thing to think about. Children and adults alike shooting across the black winter ice under a low sun, breath streaming behind them, the whole frozen lake turned into a road and a playground at once. For carrying loads, there were sledges and sleds, which slide over snow and ice far more easily than any wheel could roll over frozen ruts, and the great beautifully carved sledges found in the richest Norse ship burials show that these were prized and important vehicles, not mere afterthoughts. A sledge drawn by a horse or hauled by people could move firewood, hay, goods, and provisions across the frozen landscape when wheeled carts were useless. And here is the clever part that ties it all together. Winter in some ways made travel easier, not harder. The frozen rivers and lakes and marshes that were barriers in summer became smooth highways in the cold, and a landscape of bog and forest and water that was slow and difficult to cross in the green months could be skimmed over on ski and skate and sledge once everything froze solid. The Norse read their winter world as a network of icy roads that opened up precisely when the ordinary roads closed. Historians still argue about how far and how routinely ordinary people travelled in the depth of winter. How much was necessity, and how much the everyday movement of a people entirely at home, in the snow, and how the different regions of the far-flung Norse world varied in all this. But the skis and the bone skates and the great sledges in the graves leave. No doubt that the Vikings were not trapped and helpless in their winter. They moved through it with real skill, and some of them, gliding across a frozen fjord under the winter stars, surely even enjoyed it. There is a quirky little tidbit worth keeping. The English word ski comes straight from the Old Norse word skid, meaning a split length of wood, and when you strap on a pair of skis on a mountain today you are, in a small way, speaking Viking. The same goes, more distantly, for a good many of our winter and weather words, because the people who lived closest to the ice left their language stamped all over the way we still talk about it. So do not picture the Norse only as huddled indoors waiting the winter out. Picture them, on a clear cold day in the frozen snow month, striking out across the white world on gliding skis, poling swiftly over a frozen lake on skates of polished bone, hauling a laden sledge along a river turned to a road of ice, moving through the winter with the ease of people who had known it all their lives and were, in the truest sense, its natives. And then picture them turning for home as the brief light fails, the longhouse smoking gently in the blue dusk ahead, the promise of the fire and the hot pot and the furs. Drawing them back in, out is well and good, but in on a winter night is always better, and they knew it, and so, by now, do you. The stores in the pantry were the foundation of winter eating, but they were not the whole of it, because a clever household did not simply sit and slowly empty its barrels. It went out and added to them, taking what the frozen world still offered. And winter, for all its harshness, was not entirely empty of food for those who knew where to look. There was fishing, first of all, which did not stop when the water froze. Where lakes and rivers iced over, the Norse cut holes through the ice and fished through them, lowering lines and hooks of bone or iron into the dark cold water below, and pulling up fish through the winter, adding fresh food to the preserved. Along the coasts the sea did not freeze, and fishing from shore and from boats went on in the cold months whenever the weather allowed a man to launch, bringing in cod and other fish to be eaten fresh or added to the drying racks. The sea was the great larder of the coastal Norse, and it did not close for winter, only grew more dangerous, and men risked the cold grey water because the reward was food that no barrel could match. Then there was hunting, and the winter had its own quarry. Seals, above all, in the northern and western reaches, hunted on the ice and along the shores, and worth an enormous amount to the household, because a seal was not only meat but blubber, thick fat that could be rendered into oil for the lamps that pushed back the winter dark, and a tough hide besides. In places like Greenland, the seal hunt was not a luxury but the very backbone of winter survival, and there is grim evidence that when the seal hunts failed in the hardest years, the Norse settlements there began to starve. Birds were taken too, ptarmigan, which turn white in winter and can be snared and hunted in the snow, seabirds and their eggs in season, and whatever else could be trapped or brought down with bow and arrow. In the far north there were reindeer, hunted for meat and for their marvellously warm hides. And now and then the sea gave up its greatest prize of all, a whale, sometimes hunted in the fjords, sometimes simply found stranded on a beach. And a single stranded whale was such a windfall of meat and blubber and bone that the Old Norse word for it, hvalreki, a beached whale, became and remains a word meaning a stroke of enormous good fortune, a jackpot. Imagine the winter you were having, And then imagine a whale washing up on your shore, and you understand exactly why they made it a word for luck itself. Trapping filled in the edges, snares and deadfalls set for hares and foxes and birds, small steady additions of meat and fur that a patient trapper could bring in through the cold months. Every catch, every kill, every fish through the ice was both food for now and, if there was a surplus, more to preserve for the leaner weeks ahead. And so the hunting and the storing were really one long continuous effort that never truly stopped. Historians still argue about how much the different Norse communities leaned on hunting and fishing versus their farmed food, and how that balance shifted from the rich farmlands of Norway and Denmark to the harsh margins of Iceland and Greenland where wild food mattered far more. But everywhere, the ability to go out into the frozen world and bring back something to eat was a vital thread in the rope that held a household up across the winter. There is a hard truth folded into all this, and it is the truth that lost the Greenland settlements in the end. A people can preserve and store and ration with all the skill in the world, but if the winter runs too long, if the summer before it was too cold and wet to lay up enough, if the seals do not come and the ice does not give, and the stored food runs out before the grass returns, then no amount of cleverness is enough, and the fires go out one by one, and a priest rows up an empty fjord years later and finds only wild sheep on the hills. The Norse survived their winters not by defeating them, but by staying always one careful, step ahead, and in the places where the margin was thinnest. Sometimes that step was not quite enough. But most winters, in most places, for most of 300 years, it was enough. The lines came up with fish, the seals came in on the ice, now and then a whale blessed a lucky shore, and the household added catch to store and carried on, out ahead of the hunger all the way to spring, so as you lie warm and fed tonight, spare a thought for the man on the winter ice with his line in the black water, patient in the cold, bringing home one more fish for the fire. That patience, repeated in 1,000 cold places, is a great part of how a whole people came through the dark. Let's turn now to the quiet, ceaseless work that made every other kind of survival possible. The work that was going on in the corner of the longhouse this whole time, in the hands of the women by the fire, the making of cloth. It is easy, when we tell tales of Vikings, to talk only of raiders and ships and battles, but no ship ever sailed and no winter was ever survived without an ocean of woolen cloth, and that cloth was made, thread by thread, almost entirely by women, through endless patient hours, and above all through the long dark evenings of winter when there was little else. To do but sit by the light of the fire and work. Think of everything wool had to become, the tunics and trousers and dresses on every back, the cloaks that were coats by day and blankets by night, the socks and mittens and caps, the blankets and bed covers, and most demanding of all, the sails. For a single Viking sail could take a staggering amount of wool and an almost unimaginable number of hours to spin and weave, so that behind every famous longship, its sail bellied out with the North Sea wind, stood years of women's labour at spindle and loom. The whole seafaring, raiding, trading world of the Vikings floated, quite literally, on cloth that women made. It began with the sheep and the raw fleece, which had to be cleaned, combed, and then spun, twisted into thread on a drop spindle, a weighted stick set spinning that pulled the wool into yarn as it turned. Spinning was so constant, so much the background hum of a woman's life, that it was done everywhere and always, walking, watching the children, tending the pot in every spare moment, and the winter evenings by the fire were spinning time above all. Then the thread was woven, on the great warp-weighted loom that leaned upright against the wall of the house, its hanging threads held taut by rows of clay or stone weights, the weaver standing to pass the weft across and beat it up tight, row by row, building the cloth downward from the top. Archaeologists find those loom weights by the hundreds on Norse sites, little rings of fired clay, the silent evidence of countless hours of weaving in houses long since fallen to grass. To make the cloth warm and weatherproof, it was often fulled, washed and worked until the fibres matted and thickened into a dense wind-resisting fabric, and dyed, as we have heard, in the rich colours the Norse loved. And all of this, the combing and spinning and weaving and fulling and dyeing and finally the cutting and sewing, was the work of women, handed down mother to daughter, filling the winter, clothing the household, and underpinning the entire economy of the North. It is no accident that spinning and weaving are wound all through Norse myth and belief. The Norns, the three great fates who sit at the roots of the world tree and weave the destinies of gods and men, are weavers. The thread of a life, spun and measured and cut, is one of the oldest images the Norse had for fate itself. To a people who watched women turn wool into the very cloth that kept them alive, the idea of the world itself being woven, of lives being spun as thread, was not a strange metaphor, but the most natural thing imaginable. The loom and the spindle were not only tools of survival, they were images of destiny. Historians still argue about the full reach of women's power and status in Norse society, how much authority the mistress of a household truly held, how the picture shifts between the law codes and the sagas and the archaeology. But on one point there is no argument at all. The textile work of women was absolutely essential, valued and vast, and without it there is no Viking age at all. No warm winters, no sails, no ships, no raids, nothing. The fierce men in the stories owed their very clothes and their very ships to the patient, skilled, unending labour of the women at the spindle and the loom. There is a fitting joke in it, or perhaps just a fitting truth. The Viking age is remembered for the sword and the axe, but it ran on the spindle and the loom, and if you had taken away the wool, the whole thing would have collapsed in a single winter. So as the household settles into another long evening, see the whole picture of it. The men mending and carving, yes, but also the women spinning by the firelight, the loom against the wall slowly growing its cloth row by row, the small children learning the twist of the thread, the talk and the stories going round, and the warm garments of tomorrow taking shape in tonight's patient hands. That soft, endless work was the real armour of the North. It clothed the babies and the old, it made the blankets you're imagining over yourself right now, and it went on quietly through every winter, in the golden light of every fire. Let its rhythm carry you, the turning spindle, the beat of the loom, the slow, steady making of warmth out of the wool of the hills. Now let's speak softly for a while about the youngest and the oldest, the ones for whom the winter was hardest, and for whom the warm knot of the household mattered most of all. A Norse winter was a dangerous time to be very small or very old, and everyone knew it, and much of the quiet work of the season was the work of keeping the fragile ones warm and fed and alive until the light came back. Babies were born in winter as in any season, into the smoky, firelit world of the longhouse, and their coming was watched over by the women of the household and in spirit by the Disir, those ancestral female guardians whose favour was sought especially at the threshold of winter. A newborn in the deep cold was wrapped and swaddled and kept close to the fire and close to its mother's body, carried in the warmth, cradled in furs, and the first hard weeks of a winter-born life were a matter of constant loving vigilance. Not all of them made it. Infant death was a shadow over every family in those centuries, and the winter deepened it. And so the survival of a child through its first cold season was a real and celebrated thing, a small victory pulled out of the dark. Children who lived grew up fast in that world, and winter was a great part of their schooling. In the long indoor evenings they learned by watching and doing. The girls at the spindle beside their mothers and grandmothers, the boys at the whittling and mending beside the men, all of them soaking up the endless stories that carried the knowledge of the people, how to bank a fire, how to read the weather, the names of the gods and the deeds of the ancestors, the way to spin, to weave, to carve, to fish, to survive. There was no school but the fireside, and no teachers but the old and the winter, which forced everyone indoors together for months. It was when the young learned most of what they would need to know to keep their own households alive one day. And the old, the grandmothers and grandfathers who had come through 50 or 60 winters already, were the household's living memory and its most precious store of knowledge, and in the cold months they came into their own. Too frail, perhaps, for the hardest outdoor labour, they took the warm seat nearest the fire, and there they did the work that only long life could do. They told the stories. They remembered the hard winters of the past and what had been done to survive them. They knew the remedies, the weather signs, the old ways, the genealogies that tied the family to its land and its honour. They minded the smallest children while the able-bodied worked, and they were kept warm and fed and honoured, because a people who lived so close to the edge understood exactly how much was carried in an old person's memory, and how much was lost when they were gone. To sit an elder in the best warm place by the fire was not only kindness, it was the household protecting its own library. Historians still argue about the details of Norse family life, and how gently or harshly the very old and very young were really treated. And there are grim old stories about hard choices in the hardest famines that we cannot fully verify or dismiss. But the overwhelming picture from the sagas and the archaeology is of families bound tightly together across the generations, of the old honoured and the children treasured, of a household that survived precisely because it held all its ages close around one fire and kept, them all alive together. There is deep tenderness in that image, and it is worth resting on. The whole elaborate machine of Norse winter survival, the fire, the wool, the food, the turf walls, the shared beds, existed in the end to protect exactly these: the baby in its furs and the grandmother in the warm seat, the future and the past of the family, the two ends of the thread that the loom of the generations was slowly weaving. The strong survived so the weak could survive, and the weak, in their way, carried the very things, the memory, the knowledge, the next generation, that made the survival worth having at all. So picture the longhouse now with all its ages in it. The infant asleep against its mother, warm in the fur, the children drowsy by the fire, heads nodding as the story goes on, the grown men and women at their winter work, and the old grandmother in the warmest seat, her voice low and sure, telling once again the tale she has told through 40 winters, passing it down the line to the small ones who will tell it one day to children not yet born. That, more than any wall or fire, is how a people truly survives a winter, and 100 winters, and 300 years of them. Not one by one, but all together, the whole living chain of them, holding one another close in the warm dark, waiting for the light. Rest there a while, in that warm crowded room, among all the ages of them. It is a very safe place to be. Winter was not only cold and dark, it was the sick season, the time when bodies worn down by hard work and thin food and endless damp were most likely to fail, and so the Norse had their own store of medicine and healing to set against it. Their knowledge was a mixture of hard-won practical remedy, herb lore handed down through generations, and a good measure of charm and ritual, because to these people the line between medicine and magic was not drawn where we draw it, and a healing might involve both a poultice of herbs and a carved rune, or a spoken spell, with no sense of contradiction at all. The healers were often women, wise in the properties of plants, and the household laid up its medicines in the autumn along with its food. There were herbs for many things: yarrow and other plants to staunch bleeding and dress wounds, angelica, which the Norse valued so highly they cultivated and traded it, for aches and chest complaints and general health, garlic and onion, whose real power against infection they knew by long experience if not by name, and many more roots and leaves and barks dried and stored for the winter's ailments. Honey, that sweet gift of the bees, was used on wounds, and we know now what they knew by trial, that honey genuinely fights infection, that a wound dressed in honey is a wound given a real chance. Warmth itself was medicine, the steam bath sweating out the aches and chills, the fire's heat easing the deep cold stiffness of old joints, and broth and warm ale and good stored food were the everyday medicine that kept a body strong enough to fight off the sickness that stalked the cold months. There is a famous, vivid moment in one of the sagas that shows the Norse healer at work. After a great battle, a woman tending the wounded wants to know whether a certain man's belly wound has pierced his gut, and so she boils a strong, pungent porridge of onions and herbs and feeds it to him, and then smells the wound, for if she can smell the onions coming through it, she knows the gut is cut and the wound is mortal. It is a real, clever, practical piece of field medicine, the onion smell test, remembered in the saga because it worked, and because everyone understood its logic, and it tells you these were not helpless people fumbling in the dark but observers who had learned real things about the body from generations of hard necessity. Against the deeper enemies, though, the fevers and infections and wasting sicknesses that had no cure in any age before the modern one, the Norse had far less power, and winter took its toll. There was another quiet danger in the northern winter that they could not have named but did much to hold off by: luck and habit, the sickness that comes from a long winter without fresh food, what we call scurvy. The slow breakdown of a body starved of the goodness in green things. The Norse had no word for vitamins, but their preserved foods and their habits happened to help. Soured milk and skyer, certain preserved berries, seaweed eaten along the coasts, the fresh meat and organs of winter hunts all carried a little of the protection the body needed, and the households that kept the most varied stores fared the best. In the hardest pressed places, where the stores ran thin and the diet narrowed to the same few dried things month after month, the winter sickness bit deepest, and it was one more of the slow killers that pressed on the settlements at the edge of the Norse world. Historians still argue about how effective Norse medicine really was, how much was genuine remedy, and how much hopeful ritual, and how much of this herb lore in the later written sources reflects the true practice of the Viking age. But the graves and the sagas and the traces of cultivated healing herbs make clear that these were people with real, accumulated medical knowledge. doing what they could, often with genuine skill, against the illnesses that the cold and the dark brought down on them. There is no joke to make of the sick season, only a kind of respect. They had no doctors as we know them, no hospitals, no notion of what truly caused disease, and yet they had learned, by patient observation across the generations, a great deal that actually worked, to keep wounds clean and dress them in honey, to smell an onion through a belly wound, to eat what fresh food the winter offered, to keep the body warm and fed and strong, and when their medicine failed, as often it must have, they cared for their sick in the warm firelit house among their own, which is its own kind of medicine, and not the least of them. So as the night deepens, be glad, wherever you are, of the warmth and the safety and the health you have. The Norse fought hard for those things, with herbs and honey and steam and stored food and a fierce, patient, hard-won wisdom through every long sickness-haunted winter of the cold north. And more often than we might expect, warm and cared for by the fire, their people got well and lived and saw the spring. Let's spend a little while now with the animals, because on a Norse farm the survival of the beasts and the survival of the people were the same story told twice, and a family that lost its livestock in winter had lost its future as surely as if the fire had gone out. We have already seen the cattle wintering at the end of the longhouse, giving their body heat to the household. Now let's understand what it took to keep them, and the sheep and the horses, alive through the long cold months when nothing grew. The cattle were precious above almost all else, for their milk, their meat, and their strength, and a family measured its wealth in cows. Through the winter they stood in their byre, the stalled end of the house or a separate turf barn, and they had to be fed every single day from the hay laid up in summer, watered and mucked out, their warmth kept in and the killing wind kept off. A cow that went into winter fat and strong might come out of it in spring thin and staggering, so weak from months of standing in the dark on rationed hay that in the hardest years the beast had to be half carried out to the first spring grass. There are accounts of cattle so feeble by winter's end that they could not walk and had to be lifted. That image tells you how close the margin ran, how the hay in the barn was measured against the mouths of the animals all winter long, every forkful counting. Sheep were the hardier survivors, tough and self-reliant, and in milder places they might winter largely outdoors, foraging what they could, growing the wool that clothed everyone and giving the milk that became, the skyer and the cheese and the whey. The Norse sheep was small, hardy and doubly coated, with a long weatherproof outer fleece over a soft warm inner one, bred by the cold itself into animals that could take the winter better than their keepers. Their descendants still graze Iceland and the Northern Isles today, little changed, a living link to the flocks that kept the Vikings warm. And then there were the horses, and here again the North bred something remarkable. The small, stocky, immensely tough Norse horse, the ancestor of today's famous Icelandic horse, an animal built to endure. These horses could winter out in weather that would kill a finer breed, growing a thick, shaggy coat, digging through snow to forage, standing rump to the wind and enduring. They carried people and goods, hauled the sledges, and were so valued that fine horses were buried with their owners and celebrated in the sagas. The Icelandic horse of today, still small and shaggy and astonishingly hardy, still carrying the extra gliding gait its ancestors had, is very nearly the same animal the Norse knew, and to see one standing calm in a snowstorm is to see exactly the toughness that survival at the edge of the world demanded, of every living thing, beast and human alike. Caring for all these animals was a huge part of the winter's daily labour, work that did not stop for cold or dark or festival. The beasts had to be fed and watered every day without fail, and the amount of hay and fodder a farm could lay up in summer set a hard limit on how many animals it could keep alive through winter, which is why the autumn slaughter was so ruthless and so necessary, thinning the herd down to exactly what the stored fodder could carry. Get that arithmetic wrong, keep one too many mouths, and the hay ran out in the frozen snow month with weeks of winter still to come, and then the animals starved in their stalls, and a family watched its wealth and its future die in the dark. Historians still argue about the exact scale of Norse animal husbandry, and how the balance of cattle and sheep and horses shifted across the different lands, and how much the failure of winter fodder, the bad summers, the snow lying late on the hayfields, drove the collapse of the settlements that failed. But the fundamental truth is stark and clear. On a Norse farm, to keep your animals alive through winter was to keep yourself alive, and the two could not be separated. The hay in the barn was the family's life as much as the animals, and the daily winter round of feeding and watering and warming the beasts was as much a part of survival as tending the fire or guarding the food. There is something quietly moving in it. The family and their animals bound together against the cold, sharing the longhouse and the body heat. The people rationing out the summer's hay to carry the beasts to spring. The beasts giving back their warmth and their milk and, in the end, their lives. They came through the winter together or not at all. So picture the byre at the end of the house on a deep winter night. The cattle standing warm in the dark. The sheep folded close. The shaggy little horses enduring the weather outside, and the whole farm, human and animal, breathing slowly through the cold toward the far-off spring. Every one of them mattered. Every one of them was, in the truest sense, family. There is a law older than any king in the Norse world, a rule that everyone understood and almost no one broke, and it was never more important than on the coldest nights of the year, the law of hospitality, the sacred duty to give shelter and food to the traveller who came to your door out of the dark. In a land of vast frozen distances and killing weather, where a person caught out in the cold far from home could very easily die, the offering of warmth and a roof and a meal to a stranger was not merely good manners. It was a matter of life and death, understood by all to be owed, and it bound the scattered households of the north into a single web of mutual survival. If you were the traveller, benighted in a snowstorm with the cold reaching into your chest, the sight of a longhouse smoking in the dusk meant salvation, and you could go to that door in reasonable confidence that you would be taken in, warmed at the fire, fed from the pot, and given a place to sleep, whoever you were, because that was simply how it was done. And if you were the household, you gave that shelter knowing that one day it might be you or your son or your father out, in the storm knocking at a stranger's door, and that the whole fragile system of survival across a frozen land depended on everyone honouring the same unspoken bargain. The Old Norse poetry is full of this wisdom. The Havamal, the great collection of Norse sayings put in the mouth of Odin himself, opens with the needs of the guest, fire for the one who comes in with cold knees, food and dry clothes for the traveller, a warm welcome and a kind word. It speaks with real tenderness of how much a cold, tired, hungry wanderer needs, and how little it costs to give it, and it lays down, as something close to holy, the duty of the host to provide and the manners the guest owes in return. That a warrior culture famous for its ferocity should place such weight, in its oldest wisdom poetry, on being kind to a cold stranger tells you something true and often forgotten about these people. They were hard because their world was hard, but they had learned, precisely because their world was hard, that no one survives it alone, and that the warmth you give to a stranger tonight is the warmth you may beg from a stranger tomorrow. Hospitality reached beyond the lone traveller too. Winter was the great season of visiting and being visited, of feasts thrown and invitations honoured, of the bonds between households renewed over ale and fire. A chieftain kept his standing by his generosity, by the size and warmth of the welcome he gave, by the open hand at his hall. A stingy host was a shamed man, and an open-handed one was loved and followed. Gifts were given and returned, hospitality was repaid with hospitality, and through all this coming and going in the cold months the community wove itself, tighter so that when real trouble came, a fire, a failed harvest, a family in want, there were bonds of obligation and friendship already in place to lean on. The generosity was warm and genuine, but it was also underneath a kind of insurance, the storing up of goodwill against the hard times that everyone knew would eventually come to someone. Historians still argue about how the ideals of hospitality in the poems and sagas matched the messier reality, how often the sacred duty was honoured, and how often self-interest or feud won out, and how much the later Christian writers shaped the picture we have. But the deep principle runs through everything the Norse left us, too consistent to be mere invention. In a world where the cold could kill and no household could stand entirely alone, the giving and receiving of shelter and welcome was woven into the very structure of survival, as real a defence against the winter as any wall of turf. There is a warmth in this that outlasts everything else about the Vikings, all the raiding and the fighting and the fearsome reputation. Strip that away, and at the bottom of their world you find a cold, tired traveller knocking at a door in the dark, and a household getting up to let him in, to sit him by the fire and put a bowl in his hands and a fur around his shoulders, asking nothing. Because that is what you do, because the night is cold and he is a person and the fire is warm and there is enough. That is a very old kind of goodness, and the Norse held to it more faithfully than we might expect of them. So on this coldest night, imagine that knock at the door, and the household rising, and the stranger stumbling in from the storm into the firelight, and the warmth and the smell of the pot safe now, taken in, one more life the winter will not have. and imagine the quiet knowledge on both sides that this is how it should be, how it has always been, how it will be for you too when your turn comes to knock. Warmth given freely in the dark. There are worse things to remember a people by. Against the great dark of winter, the Norse set not only fire and wool and stored food, but also their gods, their charms, and their beliefs, and to understand how they survived the coldest nights you have to understand the unseen world that pressed close around the longhouse in those months. For the Norse, winter was a time when the walls between the worlds grew thin, when the dead might walk and strange things move across the frozen land, and so it was a season of both dread and devotion, of doors kept shut and offerings made and the names of the gods spoken to hold the darkness at its distance. Chief among the friends of struggling humanity was Thor, the thunder god, and it is easy to forget behind the hammer and the giant slaying how beloved and how close to ordinary people Thor really was. He was the protector, the guardian of the farmstead and the common folk, the one who kept the monstrous forces of chaos and cold and the wild at bay. His hammer Mjolnir was worn as a small amulet around the necks of countless Norse men and women, a token of protection you could hold in your hand and in the deep of a winter night with the wind howling like something alive around the turf walls. The thought of Thor out there holding the line against the giants of frost and storm was a real and steadying comfort. The frost giants themselves, the Jötnar, were in a sense the winter made into persons, the vast, cold, ancient forces of the freezing wild that the warm human world of the farm was forever set against and that Thor forever fought. Then there was Freyr, the god of fair weather, good harvests, peace and plenty, to whom the people turned for the return of the fruitful season, whose boar shone in the Yule feast, and whose favour meant the difference between a summer that filled the barns and one that left them empty. To honour Freyr at midwinter was to pray, in the darkest and most barren hour, for the green world to come again, for the sun to climb back into the sky, for the grass and the grain and the lambs, for survival itself dressed in the promise of spring. And over the winter sky, in the wildest and eeriest of the old beliefs, rode Odin at the head of the wild hunt, a ghostly host of the dead and the storm spirits, thundering across the night on the winter wind, and woe to the traveller caught out under it, on the wildest nights when the gale screamed over the roof and strange sounds moved in. The dark, it was the hunt passing over, and people kept indoors and kept their heads down and were glad of their walls. The Norse met all this the way they met everything, practically. They made offerings, the blot, giving food and drink and sometimes the blood of animals back to the gods and the land spirits and the ancestral dead, especially at the great winter thresholds, to keep the powers of the world friendly and the household safe. They carved runes for protection and luck, spoke charms over the sick and the endangered, and kept the small usages that warded off ill fortune. They set out offerings for the land wights and the household spirits, the unseen guardians of the farm, understanding that the world was full of powers that could be neighbourly or hostile depending on how they were treated, and that in winter above all it was wise to keep them sweet. None of this was separate from the practical survival we have been describing. It was woven right through it, the same hands that banked the fire and salted the meat also carving the rune and making the offering, with no sense that these were different kinds of act. Historians still argue fiercely about the details of Norse religion. How much of what we have comes filtered through Christian writers of a later age, how the beliefs varied across the vast Norse world and changed over 3 centuries, how literally any of it was held, and much of the inner life of that faith is lost to us forever. But the broad shape is clear enough, and it is deeply human. Faced with a long, dark, dangerous season that could kill them, the Norse did everything their hands could do, and then, at the edge of what hands could do, they reached for the gods, for Thor's protecting hammer and Freya's promise of spring and the wardings against the things that rode the winter wind. Belief was not a substitute for the fire and the wool and the stored food. It was the thing that went on where those ran out, the courage and the meaning and the hope that let people keep banking the coals and feeding the animals and holding on through a darkness with no visible end. So on this coldest night, picture the small hammer of Thor warm against a sleeper's chest, the offering set out at the door, the name of the protector spoken low against the howling of the wind, and the whole household trusting under its turf roof that the powers of warmth and life were stronger, in the end, than the powers of cold and death. The spring, after all, always came, and to a people who had watched it come back every year of their lives, that was proof enough that the light would win. Now let's travel to the very edge of the Norse world, out across the grey ocean to the lands where surviving winter was hardest. of all where the Vikings pushed their whole clever system of warmth and stores and stubbornness right up against the limit of what was possible, Iceland, and beyond it, Greenland. When the Norse first sailed to Iceland in the later 9th century, they came to a raw, treeless volcanic island on the edge of the Arctic, a place of glaciers and lava and black sand coasts and long dark winters, and they made it home. They found no forest to speak of, so they built in turf and stone and burned peat and driftwood and dung. They found land laced with hot springs, and they bathed in them and blessed their luck. They brought their sheep and their tough little horses, and the land, hard as it was, could just support them. Iceland became the great success story of Norse survival at the margin, a whole society built and sustained for centuries on the knowledge of how to hold off a northern winter, and its people still live there today, still speaking a language close enough to the old tongue to read the sagas their ancestors wrote. But Greenland was the true edge, the place where the margin finally ran out. Around the year 985, Eric the Red, a man exiled from Iceland for killing, sailed west and found a great cold land that he named Greenland, the salesman's name, some say, chosen to lure settlers to a place greener in word than in fact, and he led a fleet of hopeful families across the open ocean to settle it. They found narrow strips of green pasture at the heads of the fjords, backed by ice and rock, and there, incredibly, they built their farms and their churches and their whole Norse way of life, thousands of miles from home, at the very brink of the habitable world. For generations they made it work. They raised their cattle and sheep and goats. They hunted the seals that were the backbone of their winter food. They traded walrus ivory back to Europe. They baptized their children and buried their dead and lit their long fires against a cold far deeper than anything in Norway. The Greenland Norse survived winters that would have been unimaginable to most of Europe, in the same longhouses, in the same wool, by the same fires, holding the same darkness back, and for a while they thrived. And then, slowly, over the 14th and 15th centuries, the world turned against them. The climate cooled into what we now call the Little Ice Age, and the summers that had always been short grew shorter and colder. The sea ice pressed in, the hay failed more often, the seal hunts grew harder, the ships from Europe came less and less. The margin that had always been thin grew thinner, and then it was gone. We began this whole journey with what that ending looked like. The priest Ivar Bardason rowing up an empty fjord in the 14th century, and finding the western settlement deserted, the farms open to the wind, the churches silent, only feral sheep and cattle wandering the hills, and his flat, haunting words that there were no people there, neither Christian nor heathen. The eastern settlement held on longer, another 100 years perhaps, its people growing fewer and poorer and more isolated at the edge of the ice, until at last it too fell silent, and the last Norse voice in Greenland went out like the last coal of an unbanked fire, and no one knows the name of the last of them or the manner of their going. Historians still argue, and argue hard, about exactly what killed Norse Greenland: the cooling climate, the failing hay and hunts, the collapse of trade, conflict or contact with the Inuit who thrived where the Norse died, some fatal stubbornness in clinging to European farming ways in an Arctic land, or, most likely, all of these together closing in over generations. What is certain is that it was not one dramatic disaster, but a slow, quiet losing of the long battle, winter by winter, as the cold pressed in and the margin closed, until the clever old system of survival that had worked for 300 years finally had too little to work with. There is a lesson in it, and it is not a cruel one, only true. The Norse were extraordinary at surviving winter. The fire, the wool, the stores, the turf, the community, the sheer accumulated cleverness of it. And that skill carried them across oceans and let them live at the very edge of the possible for longer than we might believe. But even the best of human ingenuity has a limit. And when the world itself grows colder than the system was built for, when the summers no longer give enough to lay against the winters, then even the Vikings, even the toughest survivors of the medieval world, could be beaten by the cold in the end. So spare a last quiet thought for the Greenland Norse, the farthest flung of all these people, who lit their fires against the dark at the very brink of the world and held them, burning for 3 centuries, and who deserve to be remembered not for how they ended, but for how impossibly long, against how deep a cold they endured. Let's come back in from the cold edge of the world to the warm centre of the longhouse, and spend a gentler while on how the Norse actually passed the endless winter evenings. Not just surviving them, but filling them, because a winter is very long, and a people cannot spend every hour of it merely working and dreading the dark. The Norse knew how to enjoy themselves indoors, and the long nights by the fire were full of games and stories and music and laughter, the human warmth that matched the fire's warmth and made the cold season not only bearable but, in its own way, rich. Chief among the indoor pastimes was the board game, and the great game of the Norse world was Nefertafel, the king's table, a game of strategy played on a checkered board with carved pieces of bone or antler, or walrus ivory or glass. Unlike chess, Nefertafel was uneven by design. One player commanded a king and his few defenders in the centre, trying to help the king escape to the edge, while the other commanded a larger force of attackers trying to trap and capture him. It was a game of a small band breaking out against greater numbers, or of the many closing in on the one, and it was played and loved across the whole Norse world. Gaming pieces turn up in graves and settlements everywhere, and the sagas mention the game with the easy familiarity of something everyone knew. Picture two people bent over the board by the firelight. The carved king in his ring of defenders, the long winter evening stretching ahead, all the time in the world to think out the next move. There were dice, too, carved from bone, and other games of chance and skill and gambling that could grow heated, for the Norse were competitive people and a friendly game could turn sharp. And there was music. The Norse played, though we know less than we would like about exactly how it sounded. There were lyres and harps, plucked and strummed, and simple flutes and pipes carved from bone and wood. And there were horns, and above all there was the human voice, singing and chanting the old songs. Music filled the feasts and very likely the ordinary evenings too, and a household with someone who could play and sing was richer for it through the long dark. Then there was the spoken art that the Norse prized perhaps above all others, poetry and the telling of tales. This was a culture that loved words, that honoured the skald, the poet, who could shape verse of dazzling intricacy, and that delighted in riddles and word games and the swift, sharp, clever exchange of wit. Long winter evenings were the natural home of all this, when there was time to spin out a saga in full, to trade riddles, to recite the deeds of gods and heroes and ancestors, to compete in verse. The great poems and stories we still have, the myths of the Aesir and the sagas of the Icelanders, were kept alive and polished in exactly these firelit evenings, told and retold across the winters until they were worn smooth and perfect, and then, generations later, written down. When you read a Norse myth today, you are hearing faintly the sound of a winter evening in a longhouse 1,000 years ago, someone telling a story to hold the dark at bay. There were physical games and sports too when weather and space allowed, wrestling and contests of strength and skill, and out on the ice the skating and games we have already glimpsed, and a rough ball game played on the ice that the sagas mention, and that could, in true Norse fashion, turn violent enough to start a feud. Even the hardest people need to play, and the Norse played hard indoors and out, all through the season that might otherwise have crushed the spirit. Historians still argue over the details, exactly how Hnefatafl was played, since the full rules were never written down and have had to be reconstructed, what Norse music truly sounded like, how much of the saga material reflects real Viking Age storytelling. But the picture of the winter evening comes through warm and clear across all the uncertainty. Firelight, a game board between two players, a poet's voice rising and falling, a riddle and a laugh, a song, the old story told once more, and the whole household gathered in the light with nowhere to be and nothing to do but be together. There is a lovely truth in it that the Norse understood as well as they understood fire and wool. Survival is not only a matter of the body, of heat and food and shelter. It is a matter of the spirit too, of keeping the mind and the heart alive through the long dark, of laughter and play and story and song, of the reasons to want to see the spring and not only the means to reach it. The games and the tales by the winter fire were as much a part of how the Norse survived the coldest nights as the turf walls and the banked coals, because they kept alive the thing that all the rest was for. So picture the board, the pieces, the firelight, the voices, the long warm evening with no end in sight. That too is how you survive a winter. You fill it with the things that make a life worth the trouble of keeping. Let's sit now with the hardest part. The very bottom of the winter, the stretch the Norse called Thori, the frozen snow month, roughly the depth of what we would call late January into February, because every long winter has a low point, a time when the feasting is a distant memory and the spring is still impossibly far off, and this was it. Thori was named as if it were a person, Old Man Thori, a grim winter spirit, the killing frost given a face, and to be in the middle of Thori was to be in the teeth of the year, the coldest, darkest, hungriest, most wearing stretch of all. This was when the true test of a household's autumn preparation came due. The great slaughter of Gormanudur was months behind, its fresh abundance long since eaten or preserved. The bright fires of Yule had burned down, and now came the long grey grind, the marrow-scraping time, when you lived on what was left in the barrels in the store and hoped it would stretch. If you had laid up enough hay for the animals, enough fish and meat and grain and soured stores for the people, enough fuel for the fire, then Thorry was hard but survivable, a matter of patience and rationing and holding on. If you had misjudged, if the summer had been poor or the household too large or the winter longer than most, then Thorry was when the shortage began to bite, when the hay ran low and the animals grew thin and the people tightened their belts and the whole margin of survival narrowed down to a knife's edge. This is the season, above all, that killed the settlements that failed, and it was hard on the spirit as much as the body. By deep Thorry, the household had been shut up together in the smoky firelit dark for many long weeks. The same faces, the same walls, the same rationed food, the same endless night, with the memory of green fields grown faint and the promise of their return still far away. The Norse felt the weight of it as any people would, the wearing sameness, the confinement, the low grinding tiredness of a body and a mind that had been cold and dark bound for too long. It is no wonder their winter tales are so full of ghosts, and grudges and things that go wrong in the dark. The deep of winter is when tempers fray and old quarrels smoulder, and the mind, starved of light and space, turns strange. Surviving Thorry was partly a matter of surviving one another, of the patience and the give and take that let a crowded household hold together through the worst of the confinement without flying apart. And here, once again, the Norse answer was not to sit in grim silence and endure, but to push back. In the very middle of Thorry, at the coldest, hardest point of the whole year, they held the Feast of Thorablu, a midwinter blot in honour of the season itself, a deliberate gathering of food and drink and company set defiantly at the very bottom of the dark. It is a wonderfully Norse thing to do, and Icelanders do it still, gathering in the depth of Thorry to eat the old traditional foods, the soured and preserved and challenging things their ancestors ate, and to drink and be warm and loud together in the teeth of the frost. The logic is the same as it was at Yule, only more so. When things are at their worst, gather everyone you love into the warmest room, bring out what food you can spare and remind one another, with light and company and full horns, that you're alive and together, and that this too will pass. Historians still argue about the precise nature and antiquity of Thorablot, and how much the modern Icelandic feast reflects the true, old practice, but the deep pattern, the answer of warmth and gathering flung against the darkest point of the year, is written all through what the Norse have left us. So this is the shape of the low point, and it is worth understanding as you drift towards sleep, because it is the truest measure of how they survived at all. They did not survive Thorry by being warm and comfortable. Thorry was neither. They survived it by having prepared through all the long summer and autumn exactly for this. Enough hay, enough food, enough fuel laid up against exactly this hungry frozen stretch. And they survived it by holding together, by patience and by feasting, by refusing to let the darkest month have their spirits even when it had their comfort. And they survived it, above all, by knowing, with the certainty of people who had done it many times before, that Thorry ends, that after the frozen snow month comes Goa and the first softening, that after Goa comes the lone month, the last of it, and that after the lone month, however impossibly far away it feels in the black middle of the frost, comes the grass, and the lambs, and the light. Hold on, the whole shape of their winter said. You have been here before, you have laid up what you need. Thorry is the worst of it, and even Thorry ends. Hold on, and the light will come back. It always comes back. And now, at last, the turning. Because the winter does end, always, and there is no sweeter thing in the whole Norse year than the slow, miraculous return of the light and the warmth after the long dark, and it is a fine thing to rest on as we come toward the end of our own journey tonight. It began, the turning, almost imperceptibly. Even in the black depths of Thorry, a watchful eye could catch it. The days, which had shrunk to almost nothing, beginning to lengthen again. A few more minutes of grey light at each end, the sun climbing a little higher above the hills each noon. The Norse, who lived by the sky far more closely than we do, felt this turn keenly, and after the winter solstice buried in the heart of the cold, there was the quiet knowledge that the year had rounded its lowest point and begun, however slowly, to climb back toward the light. Then came Goa, the month named for old man Thori's daughter, and with her name a softening, the worst of the frost easing its grip, the light growing, the sense that the back of the winter had been broken. And then Einmanudur, the lone month, the last single stretch of winter, named for its position at the tail end of the cold, when spring was near enough to taste but not yet arrived. And the household counted down the final weeks with the stores perhaps running thin, but the end now truly in sight. And then, at last, spring. The Norse marked the first day of summer in their two-season year, not in June but in April, when the winter half of the year gave way to the summer half, and its coming was a joy so deep it is hard for us, who never truly fear the winter, to feel it fully. The snow retreating from the hayfields, the first green haze on the pastures, the ice breaking up on the rivers and fjords, the animals, thin and staggering from their long confinement, led or carried out at last onto the new grass, where they could graze and grow strong again under the open sky. And the lambs coming, new life dropping into the world just as the world turned warm again, the flocks renewing themselves, the promise of wool and milk and meat for the year ahead running about the greening fields on wobbling legs. After a winter in the smoky dark, to walk out into spring sunlight, to feel warmth from the sky and not only from the fire, to see green growing things and new lambs and open water, must have been a happiness close to holy. And the Norse celebrated the coming of summer with feasting and gladness, having crossed the long dark bridge one more time and set their feet, all of them, human and animal, on the far green shore. This was the whole point. This was what every banked coal and salted fish and forkful of rationed hay and story by the fire had been for. This arrival, this survival, this standing in the spring light having brought everyone you love through the dark. The winter was not defeated so much as outlasted, and the outlasting was a triumph renewed every single year. Quiet and total, a whole people and their beasts and their way of life carried across the cold and set down safe in. The returning sun, and then, of course, the work began again at once, for the summer was short and the next winter already coming, and the grass had to be cut and the fish dried and the stores laid up all over again. The whole great turning wheel of preparation beginning another revolution. The Norse never truly rested from the winter, because to survive the next one you had to spend the summer getting ready, and they knew it, and they bent to the scythe in the long summer light with the memory of Thori still fresh enough to make them cut one more field of hay. But that is a story for another night. Tonight let us leave them there in the spring in the sunlight, among the new lambs and the green fields having won. Historians still argue about a great many things in the Norse world, the calendars and the customs, the beliefs and the disasters, exactly how this or that was done, but no one argues about the shape of the year, the great turn from dark to light, from want to plenty, from the killing frost of Thori to the lambs of spring. That wheel turned for the Norse as it turns for us, and they rode it around winter after winter for 300 years, by fire and wool and stored food and cleverness, and, most of all, by holding fast to one another and to the certain knowledge that the light always, always comes back. And so it did. And so, for you too, wherever you are lying in your own warm dark tonight, it will. The winter always ends, the light always returns, and on the far side of every long cold night there is a morning and a spring and the sun climbing back over the hills. So let us leave them there, and let us leave ourselves here, warm and safe and drifting. Picture the longhouse one last time, very softly now. The long fire has burned low, banked down to a heap of gently breathing coals under soft grey ash. The turf walls hold the day's warmth close. The animals are quiet at the far end of the house, and along the benches, wrapped in wool and heavy furs, the whole household lies sleeping close together, breathing slow in the golden dark, a single warm knot of life in the middle of the frozen world. Outside, the winter wind moves over the roof, and the snow falls, and the fjord lies black and still under the stars. But in here there is warmth, and there is safety, and there is everyone you love close enough to touch. The fire will keep, the stores will stretch, the animals will hold, and the light so far away tonight is already quietly on its way back. There is nothing left to do now but rest, nothing to tend, nothing to fear, nowhere in the frozen world you need to be. Just the weight of the furs and the warmth at your back and the soft sound of breathing all around you in the dark. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let your breathing slow to match theirs. Let the last of the day's cold leave you, and feel yourself sink down into the warmth, safe as a Norse child on the sleeping bench, held by the fire and the walls and the whole warm crowded house against the long cold night. The Vikings survived 1,000 of these nights, and so will you. and the morning will come, gentle and grey and certain, just as it always does. Sleep now, you're warm, you're safe. The winter is holding and the light is coming back.